All right, buckle up because this is going to be a big one. In this video, we're going to talk about how to cite primary sources. And it's pretty complicated, so get ready. Now, the first thing I have to say is that this video really builds on the last two videos that I made about primary sources and sort of what primary sources are and how to find them. So if you haven't watched those videos yet, just pause this one, go back, watch those videos, and then come back to this one because everything we're going to talk about sort of picks up from where those videos left off. Okay, so no dilly-dallying. We have to get right into it. Let's go. So first things first, this is obviously a companion video to a video that I made a little while ago about how to cite secondary sources. So another thing that you might do before watching this video is kind of refresh your memory on that stuff, because what you'll see is there's a lot of overlap between citing certain types of primary sources and citing secondary sources. Okay, so I'm going to organize this video into three main parts. In the first part, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of general rules and principles for citing primary sources. In the second part, we're going to look at how to cite lots of different types of primary sources. I'm not going to teach you how to cite everything because that would be a massive video and I really couldn't even do it. It's not even possible. So I'm just going to take you through some of the kind of big, most common primary sources that students use in research papers. And then in the third section, I'm going to just leave off with some of my final tips and things to think about, kind of general ideas and things to think about when citing primary sources. Okay, first things first, let's go over some general rules for citing primary sources. Okay, before we get started looking at specific primary sources and how to cite them, we should cover just some general rules for citing primary sources, some general things to think of. So I have 4 basic rules that you need to know before you get started citing primary sources. First, know where you get your sources from. It's really important that you not only know what kinds of sources you're citing, but also where you're getting them from, where you're accessing those sources, because that totally changes the way that you cite something. So the first thing you need to know is not just what primary sources you have, but where you got them, where you accessed them. Second, cite what you see. This is probably the most important rule that I can give you right now. It basically just means that you are going to cite whatever version of the primary source that you actually have access to. What you can't do is cite something that makes it seem like you accessed a primary source in a way that you didn't. A good example of this is like an archival source. If you found an archival source, say in the footnotes of a secondary source, you can't cite the archival source as if it were an archival source because you didn't go to the archive. You didn't see the thing in the archive. You would have to cite it via the secondary source that you found that quote in, right? But the important thing here is that when in doubt, just cite what you see. Just cite whatever it is you're holding, whatever it is you're looking at on the screen. That's the guide to know how to cite something. Okay, when in doubt, opt for clarity and specificity. This is my third rule. And what it means essentially is that, especially with primary sources, there's oftentimes kind of gray areas. You don't always know exactly how to cite a thing because the world of primary sources is large and diverse, right? So when you're in a situation where you don't know precisely how to cite something, opt for clarity and specificity. So what I mean here is opt for adding information that clarifies exactly what the thing is and where it's specifically located, how you specifically accessed it, right? In other words, provide enough information so that a researcher later on who's reading your paper could track down that thing as easily as possible. Okay, fourth and finally, this is sort of the mantra for citing primary sources, and you'll see this kind of played out when we get into how to cite specific primary sources. Our mantra is, who did it, what it is, where it lives. This is the order of most citations for primary sources. You're going to talk about first who created the primary source or who manifested it. Then you're going to talk about what that primary source is, what type of primary source it is. And then finally, you're going to talk about, or you're going to present where it's located and how you accessed it. So almost every primary source citation follows this general pattern of who did it, what it is, where it lives. And speaking of general patterns, this video is picking up on a video that I did previously on citing secondary sources. And it's really important to kind of remember what we learned from citing secondary sources because those patterns show up in our citations of primary sources. So we should remember and remind ourselves the answer to this question, who's your bae, right? What are the main secondary sources that we learned how to cite in that previous video? Well, of course, your bae is books, articles, and essays. So we should take a second to just remind ourselves, how do we cite books, articles, and essays? And these are the basic forms. For a book, it looks something like this. Here's a book I published a few years ago, and you'll see that book citations include the author's name, the title of the book, and the publication information, which is always structured as place, press, year. For journal articles, it tends to look like this. Notice again that the author comes first, and then the title of the article, and then the title of the journal, which is in italics or underlined, and then the volume and publication information, which is just the volume, the date of publication, and then the pages that the article exists within the journal. And then finally, essays look a little something like this, right? Author's name, title of the essay, that very important word in, which tells us it's an essay, a small portion in a larger book, the title of that larger book and the editors of that book, and then the page numbers and the publication information for that book, which again is always place, press, year. Okay, so why do I bring up all these things? I bring up all these things because you're going to see these exact same patterns show up when citing primary sources. So the first thing to do is just remind yourself how to cite secondary sources, and then you will have an easier time remembering and understanding how to cite primary sources. Okay, so that laid kind of the groundwork for what we're going to do next. You know a little bit about the general rules for citing primary sources now, so let's dig into how to cite specific types of primary sources. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to kind of look at how to cite primary sources based on the three main places that you find primary sources. So I'm going to divide this into kind of three subsections. One on primary sources that are found in publications, one on primary sources that are found in archives or digital archives, and one on primary sources that are found through databases. Well, we might just start with how to cite a book, right? What if the primary source that you're looking at is a published book? This could be maybe a modern edition of an older book or just an old edition of a book that was published, hundreds of years ago. Well, the great thing is that you cite primary source books the exact same way that you cite secondary source books. For example, check out the citation for this book, which is an edition of Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. This is what that citation would look like in a footnote, and notice that it's exactly the same as a citation of a secondary source book in a footnote. The one thing to pay attention to is that more often than not, books that you're using as primary sources, especially if they're modern editions, are going to have like translators and editors. So you always need to remember to include the name of the translator or editor of that book. And the same thing goes for when you present this in a bibliography, right? You follow the same general rules of citations in bibliographies, right? You reverse the name order of the author, you put in more periods, but make sure to include, right, the people who are involved in producing that primary source, not just the author, but also the translator and or the editor. Okay, so that one is super simple, right? If it's a book, cite it like a book. That's all you need to kind of remember for citing books as primary sources. Another type of primary source that you might find, however, is some sort of document that's included in like an edited collection of primary sources or an anthology of primary sources. This is an example of one that I have. This is a small edited collection of primary sources on the democratic revolutions in 1989 throughout the world. And one document in this edited collection is a speech by Desmond Tutu. Now, the speech itself has a transcript that I think only exists in an archive in South Africa, but we can't go to South Africa, right, to get that transcription of the speech, and we weren't there for the speech itself. So the way that we have accessed the speech is as a document in an edited collection, right, a collection that Patrick Kenny put together. And when you encounter a primary source in this form, the way that you cite it is essentially exactly like an essay. So look at this citation of how we would cite this speech in a footnote. So notice that looks exactly like how to cite an essay. And similarly, if you were to cite this in a bibliography, it would look exactly like citing an essay in a bibliography. The only new thing to learn here is sort of the decision on how to cite an edited collection, right, and pieces in an edited collection. And the general rule is this. If you only use one piece from an edited collection, then cite that specific piece. But if you're using multiple documents from an edited collection, just cite the whole edited collection as a book in your bibliography, and don't cite each individual piece. So if, for example, we were using multiple documents from this edited collection on 1989, we would just put in our bibliography this citation here, which is just a citation of an edited book. Okay, nice. So we now know how to cite books, and we know how to cite essentially pieces of published primary sources, right? Pieces of edited collections. That's really important because that's going to basically comprise the vast majority of the published primary sources that you're going to be looking at. But there's one other example of a type of primary source that you often find in publications, and that's personal correspondence. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, here's an example of a letter from this publication, Debussy Letters. It's a collection of letters by Claude Debussy. And you'll notice a few things about this citation. And you'll see that for letters, the standard form is to first start with the author of the letter and then the recipient of the letter with to in the middle, right? So Claude Debussy to Blanche Marot. Then you include the date of the letter, August 24th, 1900. And then essentially you just cite the rest of it as if it were an essay in an edited volume. So again, it's really simple. This looks exactly like citing an essay, with the only change that because it's a letter, you have to kind of style the very beginning very specifically, right? With the author to recipient and the date. So one last thing to remember here is that this is the format for a letter. But if this were not a letter, right? If this were more like a telegram or a memorandum, you just have to stick one word, right? Clarifying what it is. So telegram, right in between the sort of author and recipient and the date. One other unique thing about citing personal correspondence is that when you use the short form for personal correspondence, you include not only the author of the letter, but also the recipient, right? So if we were to cite this letter again on a different page of our paper, say, we wouldn't have to do the full citation. We could use the short form, just like we learned in the last video. But instead of just putting Debussy 114, we would put Debussy de Marot. Okay, last thing to know about citing personal correspondence is that for bibliographies, you do not cite every single individual letter that you use. Instead, if you're getting letters from publications, then just cite the publication, right? Just cite the book. So in this case here, right, we have Claude Debussy or Debussy, Claude. That's the author of all these letters. Debussy Letters is the title of the book that we got the letters from. And then, of course, include all of the people involved in putting that book together. So the editors and the translator, and then the publication information, just like a normal book. Really, really simple. All right, now let's look at how to cite primary sources that we find in archives. Okay, this is when it starts to get a little more complicated, right? Primary sources in published forms and in like modern editions of primary sources and collections of primary sources, that's pretty easy. You cite it almost exactly like the secondary sources that we learned how to cite. Archival documents are a totally different ballgame. So let's first start with what Turabian says about citing documents from archives. So here's what she writes. She says, documents from physical collections of unpublished manuscripts involve more complicated and varied elements than published sources. That's right. In your citations, include as much identifying information as you can. Format the elements consistently and adapt the general patterns outlined here as needed. If possible, identify the author and date of each item, the title or type of document, the name of the collection, and the name of the depository. Okay, let me just break down this quote really quickly because I think there are some important things to focus on here. First, what you want to include in a citation of an archival document, if at all possible, is the author, date, the title, type of document, the name of the collection, and the name of the archive or the depository. That's really what you're shooting for all your archival document citations. But the fact of the matter is that archives organize their documents really differently. The important thing to remember is that you should format all of your citations of archival documents consistently. So there are a lot of kind of choices that you can make here in citing archival documents, but the one thing that you have to stick to is a consistent kind of choice on where you put things and which information you include. Okay, so let's take a shot at one of these. So here's an archival document that I found in an archive in Besançon, France. And it is a sermon written out by a priest from the early 19th century. So here's my attempt to try to identify the author, the date, the title, type of document, name of collection, and name of depository, as we were sort of told we need to do by Turabian. So in a footnote, I would cite this document like this, right? Maxime Brocard, that's the author of the sermon. Amour de Dieu, that is the title of the sermon. And then literally the word sermon to identify what type of primary source this is. And 1828, the year in which this sermon was written. And then comes all the information about the collection and the archive. And the way that I like to format this, and there's no really hard and fast rules. You can sort of order this how you want. But the way that I like to organize this information is to go from sort of biggest to smallest. So I first identify the archive that I consulted, right, the depository, and then I list the collection and whatever like collection number or call number or whatever sort of identifying thing there is for that document, right, that comes right after that. And then if there were page numbers or folio numbers for this document, I would include that last, right, so the specific page of the document from the specific box, from the collection, from the archive, right, so sort of think of it as going from biggest to smallest. But there are lots of other different types of documents that show up in archives. And so the first thing to kind of know about archival documents is you have to identify what it is, right? Remember our mantra before that we want to identify sort of who did it, what it is, and then where it lives, right? So here's an example of a thing that we've already learned how to cite, but as if it were to appear in an archive, right, instead of a publication. So here's a letter, right? And we cite it exactly like the format of a letter that we learned before. Isaac Joseph Berruyer to Leonardo Schiederer, December 31st, 1737, right? That is the form that letters take when you identify sort of who it is and what it is, right? And then you follow my guidelines of the depository and collection, right? So the depository or the archive is the Archives Françaises de la Compagnie Jésus. The collection is the Dossier Berruyer, and then the identifying information from that collection, right? It's document number 4, and this actually has folio numbers, or in other words, page numbers, right? So 1 recto, that's what that is. Okay, so there you go. That's an example of citing a letter from an archive. But again, the important thing to remember is that when citing archival documents, you just want to follow our mantra of who did it, what it is, where it lives. The last thing to know about archival documents is that in general, you don't cite every single archival document that you consult in a bibliography. Instead, you cite collections in your bibliography. So if we go back to that other document that I cited from the very beginning, the Brocard sermon, right? I wouldn't cite every single sermon in that collection. Instead, what I would do is cite the collection itself. So the collection name is just Fonds Anciens, right? It's the old collection, right? Number 218. And I put in parentheses here just for clarifying sake. And this is where, you have a little bit of gray area to kind of add things if you think they will clarify and help people understand what things are. So I added in parentheses just Sermons of Maxime Brocard. There's no official title for that collection, but that's what it is, right? And so that helps to add something like that, clarifying information in order for readers to know exactly what your sources are. And then when citing an archival collection in a bibliography, right, you just cite the collection, put a period, and then the archive, right? Then the depository. So the Archives Historiques du Diocèse de Besançon in Besançon, France. Boom. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, why the heck did I have to learn how to cite archival documents from Besançon, France? Most of you are not going to be hopping on a plane to get to France to find archival documents for your research papers. So the form of archival documents that you're actually probably going to encounter are archival documents in digital archives. Now remember from a previous video, right? The digital archives are just photographs of archival documents that are posted on the websites of archives. So here's a really good example, right, of a letter by Thomas Jefferson that is held at the Library of Congress. So what changes when you cite an archival document via a digital archive, when you access it online rather than actually going to the physical place and picking it up with your hands? Well, the answer is, thankfully, not much. You follow the exact same rules as citing an archival document. The only difference is that you just plop on the URL of the website or the web page that you access this document through at the very end of the citation. Boom, easy. Okay, so you might be getting good at citing letters, but what about other types of documents that show up in archives, and specifically in digital archives? Well, let me give you an example of something different, an oral history interview. Interviews are wonderful primary sources to use for all sorts of types of historical projects, so I highly encourage you to look at oral histories as for your primary sources. They take a slightly different form, but again, the big point here is that they follow the general pattern, right, of who did it, what it is, where it lives. So here's an interview of a person named Abdullah Hasik. And the way you would cite this interview is you would first start with who did it, right? Who is giving the interview? Abdullah Hasik. The person who's interviewing Hasik, so interview by Stephen Mays Sloan. The date of the interview, August 14th, 2015. The place of the interview and the fact that you're consulting a transcript, right? So Fort Worth, Texas, transcript. And then just the archival information, the way that we've looked at it before, right? So the archive, Baylor University Library, the collection, Institute for Oral History Interviews. You can put in here if there's a page number, right? Page 3, and then just boop, paste the URL at the end. One small thing, if you're just kind of curious, how do you do the short form of an interview? This is how it goes, right? You use the last name of the person being interviewed and just the word interview, and then whatever page number or identifying information you need to identify what part of that interview you're citing. Okay, and final thing, right? Like archival documents, you tend not to cite every single archival document in your bibliography. Instead, in a bibliography, you're just going to cite the collection. So for this example, right, what you put in your bibliography is just the collection's name, right? Institute for Oral History Interviews, and then the depository, Baylor University Library, Waco, Texas. And the only difference here between citing a collection in an archive that you visited and citing a collection of an archive that you visited digitally, right, or accessed digitally, is you just tack on the URL for the collection at the end. Okay, one other type of source that you might be accessing via digital archives are like visual material. So think artwork, material culture, things like that. Chances are you're not going to be able to actually kind of pick up and touch, the original forms of these types of materials. So you're going to be seeing sort of images of these things as they're available on like digital archives. And again, before we get going on looking at exactly how to cite things, we should look at the general principles that Turabian lays down in her book. Here's what she says about citing visual materials. She writes, "Cite paintings, sculptures, photographs, drawings, and the like only in notes. Include the name of the artist, the title of the artwork, in italics, and date of its creation, preceded by circa, if approximate, and the name of the institution that houses it, if any, including location. You may also include the medium and related information if relevant. For images consulted online, include a URL." Okay, so a few things to pick up on here, right? First is that with visual images, more often than not, you're only going to cite these things in footnotes. You don't generally cite every single painting that you consult in a bibliography. Second, the things that we need to include in the citation are the name of the artist, the title of the piece, the date of its creation, the name of the institution that houses it, right, and its location, and maybe the medium that it is, right, to help clarify what exactly it is. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, first let's start with maybe a piece of visual material from a publication, right? Here's a photograph that I found in a primary source reader that I have. It's photographed from the Mexican Revolution of people sort of involved in the fighting. So how would you cite a photograph that is in a publication? Well, again, now we're going to harken back to what we learned in the last video. You cite it very much like an essay, just with a few differences at the beginning. So here we have George Layton. This is the name of the photographer. And then photographs of soldiers and soldaderas, which is the name of the photograph, but really the collection of photographs. We have the date of the photograph, which here is not specific. It's a circa 1910 to 1920. We don't know exactly when this photograph was taken, but we know it was sometime from 1910 to 1920. And then the medium, which is photograph, right? And then look at this, something we recognize in, that very important word, and then information for the book that I found it in. So you're almost treating it like an essay. You're citing it almost exactly like an essay. But what if the visual image comes not from a publication, but from a digital archive? Well, then it's actually even easier, right? We're going to follow the same basic principles of trying to name the artist, the title of the piece, the date of its creation, right? The name of the institution. But we just indicate that it's from a specific, digital archive. So here's an example of an artifact, right? A piece of a tombstone that exists from the 11th century. The name of the piece, according to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website, is just Tombstone, right? So there you go. You start with the name of the piece. There's no artist or producer that's identified, right? So you're going to skip that. If you don't have that information, don't include it, right? You can't include it. And then after the name of the piece, you produce the date in which it was created, which is June 4th, 1036. And then you identify what it is. It's a sandstone tablet. Then you end by just identifying the depository, right? So the institution that houses it is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, New York. And since I didn't go there and pick that thing up with my bare hands in New York City, I have to also include the URL because that's actually where I saw the thing. So remember our rule, right? Cite what you see. If you don't see the physical object itself, you're going to have to cite the URL in which you consulted or in which you saw that object. Okay, we are almost done. Let's finish up this look at how to cite primary sources by looking at citations that we find in databases. Okay, let's remember what a database is, right? A database is essentially a website or some sort of subscription kind of research portal, usually that consults basically different archival collections, usually on the same topic. A great example of a type of database that you'll probably use at some point is a database of historical newspapers, including this database, America's Historical Newspapers, which Baylor University has access to. And in general, I will say that newspapers are great primary sources to use for historical research. And more often than not, you are not going to consult them in their physical copy, right? In their physical form. You're not going to go to an archive and pick up a 100-year-old newspaper. How you will consult newspapers are generally through databases. So learning how to cite newspapers really goes hand in hand with learning how to cite things from databases too. So let's look at an example. Here is an article that I found using a database called America's Historical Newspapers. This article is by Gabriel Neath, and the title of the article is Forecast for the Year 1917. It was published in the newspaper The Beaumont Daily Journal from Beaumont, Texas, and it was published on January 1st, 1917. Okay, so citing newspapers is really, really simple. It looks a lot like citing kind of journal articles, essentially, right? You include the name of the author of the article, the title of the newspaper, and usually with newspapers, you're going to also put in parentheses the place that the newspaper was published, right? So Beaumont, Texas. But that's because a lot of newspapers are called things like the Times or the Picayune or whatever, right? They don't specify exactly where they're from. So it's always good practice to just put the city in which the newspaper is from. And then all you include is the date of the publication of the newspaper, right? What day was it published on? And then if you get it from a database, which presumably you will, you just tack on the name of the database at the very end. So here, America's Historical Newspapers database. Boom. Easy. If, as Turabian says, a single newspaper article is like a crucial piece of your argument, or you analyze it multiple times and cite it multiple times throughout the course of your paper, you might actually cite the article itself in your bibliography. You have the freedom to do that if you so choose. If so, you do it just like this. It looks really similar to how you cite a newspaper article in a footnote, just following the general conventions of what citations and bibliographies look like. But in general, my advice is not to include every newspaper article in your bibliography, but rather to just include a list of the newspapers you consulted in your bibliography. That, I think, is a really good practice because it shows the kinds of primary sources that you're using, right? It includes it in your bibliography so that it's not sort of forgotten, but you don't go through the details and the hassle of having to cite every single itty-bitty little article that you look at. Another type of source that you might consult via databases are magazines. So much like newspapers, magazines are cited really similarly to journal articles. So think of that general format when you're citing them. And if you consult them via databases, you're going to do exactly what you did with newspapers, which is tacking the name of the database on at the end of the citation. All right, so what's this look like? Well, I found a magazine article from a magazine called Punch from the 19th century in London, England. And here's how we would cite it in a footnote. This article doesn't actually have an author's name, so I've omitted that, but I've included the title of the article, which is Punch's Letters to His Son, and then the title of the magazine, Punch Magazine, and the date of the magazine, August 13th, 1842. That's the date that the magazine was published. Notice here you don't actually include the issue number or the volume number or any of those things when you're citing magazines as primary sources. You just include the title of the article, the title of the magazine, and the date of publication. And then whatever page number you're citing or you're pulling a quote from or whatever. And of course, if you consult something through a database, you just tack on the name of the database at the end. Punch Historical Archive Database is the database that I use to find this. Unlike newspaper articles, magazine articles are generally included in bibliographies. So what would you do to transform this into a citation for a bibliography? Well, just do the normal things that you usually do when you transform a footnote citation into a bibliography citation, right? You put in some periods. If the author's name were there, you would reverse the name order of the author's name, and you keep all the data basically the same. Okay, so we've hit a lot of different types of primary sources here and figured out how to cite these things in both footnotes and bibliographies. There's really one category of primary sources that we haven't really talked about, and that's government documents. But, government and public documents are a headache. That's because the citation standards for government documents are really particular, and they vary depending on which government we're talking about, right? If we're talking about government documents from the US, they're cited one way. If we're talking about government documents from Britain, they're cited another way. Every country has its own kind of standards. So I can't really go into depth here to tell you how to cite things like laws or statutes or congressional hearings or judicial cases or things like that. Those are all great documents to use, and I highly encourage you to find them and to use them. But to cite them, you really just need to consult Turabian, because Turabian has a whole section on public documents that goes into detail about how to cite various types of public documents, from laws to court cases to the U.S. Constitution itself. All right, so that was a whirlwind. If you're still with me, bravo, props to you. We're going to end this video by talking very quickly about a few final tips and things to think about when citing primary sources. So I know that citing primary sources is a lot. It's really technical. You have to be really meticulous to get it right. And it's sometimes a little aggravating, but it's really, really important. And that's the first point I want to make. It's really important to cite primary sources well. And the main reason it's important is because this is the kind of building block that you provide for future researchers. It's the way that you provide support for other people to do research in similar fields. You're probably benefiting already from the citations that other historians have laid out and produced for their primary sources. You take those things and run with them in order to do your own research. So we have to sort of pay forward the kinds of gifts that we've been given from other people's citations. So that's the first thing to kind of remember, is that the reason we go through all this pain and trouble of citing primary sources is because we're paying forward the kind of gift that's been given to us by previous historians who have done this work. Second, don't forget that citations are really important also because they help you avoid all sorts of academic transgressions like plagiarism and all sorts of academic misconduct issues. This is the way you protect yourself from doing something that's sort of against the professional or institutional rules that you're having to abide by. So cite primary sources well for your own protection. Okay, third point, and third kind of thing to think of, is that when you cite something in your paper, you are communicating to your reader that that is the thing that you have seen. So, for example, if you cite a document that's in another language, you're telling the reader, hey, look, I saw this document that's in a different language and I read it in that language. You're essentially communicating like, hey, I can read German, or hey, I can read Japanese, right? So it's really, really important for this reason to do what I said at the very beginning of the video and cite what you see. If you're seeing something in translation, you have to make sure to communicate that you are seeing that in translation and not in the original language. If you're only seeing a primary source that's reproduced in some other volume, then you have to show that in the way that you cite. So citations are a way to communicate to readers what you have actually seen. You've actually sort of had in your hands or seen on the screen and consulted. That's really, really important because it communicates who you are as a researcher as well. And along those lines, there's a convention that we use when citing something that we haven't necessarily seen, but we got from another source. So pretend that you're reading like a secondary source And the historian that wrote that secondary source quoted a line from a letter that was from, I don't know, a letter that's in an archive somewhere. And you can't get to that letter, right? You can't actually go to the archive and pull it up yourself. Well, you can still sort of use that quote as long as you cite it appropriately. And the convention that you use to cite something that you haven't seen, but that you're citing based on what, based on something that someone else has seen, right? Someone else is quoting, is a convention called quoted in. And Turabian has a whole section on this. You have to go to Turabian chapter 17, section 9, subsection 3. Double check me on that, but I think it's right. To look at how to do this. But it's really simple. Basically, all you have to do is cite the original source, the primary source, right? The thing that is being quoted, the letter, if you will, and then put quoted in and cite the secondary source. It's really important that you follow that convention, though, because if you just cite the primary source, you are communicating to your reader that you went to the archive in Dusseldorf, right, and saw this letter yourself. If you didn't do that, you cannot show that you did that, right? You can't say that you did that. So you have to use this convention of quoted in order to communicate that I haven't actually gone to Dusseldorf to see that letter, but I saw this quote in another source. Okay, two more last things. First, when compiling a bibliography, I know in this video we basically just talked about specific citations, but when you put them all together into a bibliography, one tip that I would give you is to separate out your primary sources from your secondary sources. And you can just do that really easily by having kind of a heading or some sort of subsection or something, right? Primary sources, and then list all your primary sources, and then secondary sources. This is really helpful to readers to kind of quickly get a sense of your methods, right? Of the historiography that you've consulted. It really helps the research process and the analysis of your research if you kind of organize in this way. Okay, and final thing, this video has just scratched the surface of citing primary sources, okay? I've given you a few examples of really common primary sources that I see in students' papers, but the reality is that you might be consulting sources that I didn't even talk about. The best example here is like government documents. There's a whole world of ways to cite government documents depending on what the government is, what the document is. I mean, it's all kind of crazy. So the most important thing that you should know kind of at the end of this video is that if you didn't get what you needed from this video, right? If you didn't learn how to cite the thing that you need to cite, then just go look at Turabian again, right? Turabian has many more examples and explanations of how to cite things that you might come across. So make sure to keep a copy of Turabian with you, right? And to use Turabian and consult Turabian in order to get your citations right. Whew. Okay, that was a whirlwind. Good job. See you in class.